And more companies fail, and governments go back to the printing press. So in practice, this big engine that determines how much food is grown, whether you'll have to sell your kidneys to feed your family, whether the factory down the road will make zeppelins, whether the restaurant on the corner can afford the coffee beans, all this important stuff has no one in charge of it. It is a runaway train, the driver dead at the switch, the passengers clinging on for dear life as their possessions go flying off the freight cars and out the windows, and each curve in the tracks threatens to take it off the rails altogether. There is a small number of people in the back of the train who fiercely argue about when it will go off the rails, and whether the driver is really dead, and whether the train can be slowed down by everyone just calming down and acting as though everything was all right. These people are the economists, and some of the first-class passengers pay them very well for their predictions about whether the train is doing all right and which side of the car they should lean into to prevent their hats from falling off on the next corner. Everyone else ignores them. Hey, Connor, his broker said. His voice tight and nervous. His cheer transparently false. What's wrong? Cut to the chase. Man, Ira's voice was so tight it twanged. You're such a straight shooter. It's why you're my favorite customer. What's wrong? Ira, Command Central roared around him, a buzz of shouts and conversations and profanity. So, you remember those bonds we took you into? Connor's chest tightened. He forced himself to stay calm. I remember them. Well, they were paying out really well, you saw the statements. 8% last month. I saw the statements. Well, Ira, Connor said. Stop being such a goddamned salesman and tell me what the hell is going on, or I'm going to hang up this phone and call your boss. Connor, Ira said, his voice hurt. Look, we're buddies. We're not buddies. You're a salesman. I'm your customer. I'm hanging up now. Wait. Come on, wait. Okay, here it is. There's a little liquidity crisis in the underlying assets. Connor translated the broker speak into English. They don't have any money. They don't have any money this month, he said. Look, the coupon on this contract has been through the roof for more than a year. Ultimately, it can't lose, either, because of how we've packaged it with a credit default swap. But right now, this instant. They're having a tough one-time-only squeeze. After the first month's interest had paid out. Connor had liquidated several other holdings and bought more of the bonds, bought big. So big that the brokerage had FedExed him a bottle of champagne. He'd lost track of how much he had tied up with Ira's fully hedged scheme, but he knew it was at least $150. That had seemed like such a good bet. What kind of one-time-only squeeze? Nintendo, the broker said. They've loosened up their monetary policy lately. The star farmers in Mushroom Kingdom are bringing up huge crops, and so Mario coins are dropping off in cost. But the word is that this is just a temporary gambit because they've had such a huge rush of new players who can't afford to keep up with the old-timers, so they're trying to lower commodity prices to keep those players on board. But once those players catch up and start demanding more power-ups, the prices'll bounce back. It sounded plausible to Connor. After all, they'd done similar things in their own games. The experienced players howled as inflation lowered the value of their savings, but a player who'd been honing his tune for 2 years wasn't going to quit over something like that. The new blood was vital to keeping the game on track, replacements for the players who got old, or bored, or poor, any of the reasons behind the churn that caused some players to resign every month. Churn was one of his biggest economic problems. You could minimize it in lots of sneaky ways. Email a former player to tell him that you were about to delete the tune he hadn't touched in a year and there was a 1 in 3 chance that he'd sign up to play again, rather than doom this forgotten avatar to the bit bucket. But ultimately some players would leave, and the only thing for it was to bring new players in. The broker was still droning on. So really, we expect a huge surge in 4 to 8 weeks, more than enough to make up for the drop. And if things go bad enough, there's always the prince and his bets. What's the bottom line? Connor said. Bottom line, Ira said. Bottom line is that there's no coupon this month. The underlying bonds are selling at a 20% discount off face value. He swallowed audibly. That's 60% off what you paid for them in this package. But if things get bad enough, you'll recoup with the insurance. Connor tried to keep listening, but his breath was coming in tight little gasps. 60%. He'd just had more than half his net worth vanish into thin air. The worst part was that he had other obligations, a mortgage, payments due on some of the little startups he'd bought into, money to pay the contractors who were fixing up the holiday cottage he'd bought as a rental property in Bermuda. Without the cash he'd been expecting from these investments, he could lose it all. Oblivious, the broker kept talking. Which is why our recommendation today is to buy. Double down. Excuse me, Connor said. Loud enough that the people closest to him in Command Central looked up from their feeds to stare at him. He scowled at them until they looked away. Did you say buy? There's never been a better time, the salesman said. Connor pictured him in his cubicle, a short-haired middle-aged guy in an old suit that had once been tailor-made, a collection of bad habits glued to a phone. Chewed down fingernails and twitching knees, a trash can beside him filled with empty coffee cups, screens everywhere around him flickering like old silent films. Look, any idiot can buy when the market is up, but how much higher does the market go when it's already at the top? The only way to make real money, big money, is to bet against the herd. When everyone else is dumping their holdings. That's the time to buy, when it's all down in the basement. Connor knew that this made sense. It was the basis of his prickle equations, it was the basis of all the fortunes he'd amassed to date. Buying stuff that everyone else wanted was a safe, an interesting bet that paid practically nothing. Buying into the things that everyone else was too dumb to want, that was how you got rich. Ira, Connor said. I hear what you're saying, but you've seen my accounts. I can't afford to double down. I'm maxed out. Connor, pal, he said, and Connor heard the smile in his voice and he smiled himself, a reflex he couldn't tamp down even if he'd wanted to. You're not tapped out. You've got a liquidity problem. You have a relationship with this brokerage. That's worth something. Hell, that's worth everything. We got you into this problem, and we'll get you out of it. If you need some credit. That's absolutely doable. Let me talk to our credit department and get back to you. I'm sure we can make it all work. Connor was overcome by an eerie, schizophrenic sensation. It was as if his brain had split into two pieces. One piece was shaking its head vigorously, saying, "Oh no, you're out of your mind. There's no way I'm putting more money into this thing. No, 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 Christ, no." But there was another part of his mind that was saying he's right, the best time to buy is at the bottom of the market. These things have been paying out big time. The explanation makes sense. Just think of how you'll feel when you don't buy in and the security bounces back, all that money you'll miss out on. Think of how you'll feel if you clean up and can buy a bigger house, another income property, a new car. Think of how all these jerks will drool with envy when you make a killing. And his mouth opened and the words that came out of it were, "All right, that sounds great. I'll take as much as you can sell me on margin." On margin, that was when you bought securities with borrowed money, because you were sure that the bets would pay off before you had to pay the money back. It was a dangerous game. If the margin call came before the bets paid off, or if they never paid off, it could wipe you out. But these were not bets, really. The way that the brokerage had packaged them, they were fully hedged. The worse the underlying bonds did, the more the bets against them from the prince paid off. There might be some minor monthly variations, but when it was all said and done, he just couldn't lose. Buy, he said. Buy, buy, buy. Through the rest of the day, he was so preoccupied with worry over his precarious position that he didn't even notice when every other executive in Command Central had a nearly identical conversation with their brokers. Wei Dong's mother was the perfect reality check when it came to games and the Webleys. He'd never appreciated it before he left home, but once he'd gone to work as a Turk, his mom had tried to re-establish contact by clipping stories about games and gamers and emailing them to him. It was always stuff he'd absorbed through his pores months before, being reported to outsiders with big screaming OMG WTF headlines that made him snicker. But he came to appreciate his mom's clippings as a glimpse into a parallel universe of non-gamers, people who just didn't get how important all this had become. The best ones were from the financial press, trying to explain to weirdos who invested in Game Gold exactly what they had bought. And those clippings were even more important now that he'd come to China. Mom still thought he was in Alaska, and he made sure to pepper his occasional emails to her with references to the long nights and short days, the wilderness, the people, a lot of it cut and pasted verbatim from the tweets of actual Alaska tourists. Today, 3 weeks into the strike, she sent him this. A union for video gamers. They call themselves the Industrial Workers of the World Wide Web, and they claim that there are over 100,000 of them today, up from 20,000 just a few weeks ago. They spend their days and nights in multiplayer video games, toiling to extract wealth from the game engines, violating the game company's exclusive monopoly over game value. The crops these gold farmers raise are sold on to rich players in America. Europe and the rest of the developed world, and the companies that control the games say that this has the potential to disrupt the carefully balanced internal economies. Wei Dong spacebarred through the article, skimming down. It was interesting to see one of his mother's feeds talking about Webblies, but they were so old school about it. Explaining everything. Then he stopped, scrolled back up. Mysterious, influential pirate radio host who calls herself Giandi, whose audience is rumored to be in the tens of millions, creating a rare and improbable alliance between traditional factory workers and the gamers. This phenomenon is reportedly repeating itself around the Pacific Rim, in Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia and Vietnam, though it's unclear whether the IWWWW chapters in these countries are mere copycats or whether they're formally affiliated, under a single command. Wei Dong looked up from his screen at the mattress where Lu and Jia had collapsed after staggering in from the latest broadcast. Jia's face so much younger in repose. Could she really be this famous DJ that Mom, all the way across the world in Los Angeles, was reading about? There was more, screens and screens more, but what really caught his attention was the mention of the market turmoil that was sending bond and stock prices skittering up and down. He didn't understand that stuff very well. Every time someone had attempted to explain it to him, his eyes had glazed over, but it was clear that the things that they were doing here were having an effect, a massive effect, all over the world. He almost laughed aloud, but caught himself. Matthew was sleeping all of 6 inches from where he sat, and he'd run the picket skirmishes for 22 hours straight before keeling over. Wei Dong had fought too, but he'd been mostly tasked to recruiting more Turks to his little list of friendly operatives, a much less intense kind of game. Still, he should be sleeping. Not pecking at his laptop. In 6 hours. He'd be back on shift, with only a bowl of congee and a plate of dumplings to start the day. He folded down his laptop's lid and stretched his arms over his head, noting as he did the rank smell of his armpits. The single shower, ringed with a scary-looking electrical heater that warmed up the water as it passed through the showerhead, wasn't sufficient for all the Webblies who slept in the flat, and he'd skipped bathing for 2 days in a row. He wasn't the only one. The apartment smelled like the locker rooms at school or like the homeless shelter near Santee Alley that he used to pass when he went out for groceries. He heard a little chirp from somewhere nearby, the cricket soft buzz of a mobile phone ringing. He watched as Jia sleepily pawed at the little purse by her pillow, its strap already looped around her arm, and extracted a phone, blearily answered it. Wei. Her sleepy eyes sprang open with such force that he actually heard her eyelids crinkling. Her bloodshot eyes showed her whole iris, and she leapt up, shouting in slangy Chinese that came so fast he couldn't understand her at first. But then he caught it. Police. Outside. Go go go. There were 58 Webblies sleeping in the safe house, and in an instant they all shot out of their blankets, most of them already dressed, and jammed their toes into their shoes and grabbed little shoulder bags containing their data and personal possessions and crowded into the doorway. They worked in near silence, the only sound urgent whispers and curses as they stepped on each other's shoes. Some made for the window, leaping out to grab the balcony of the opposite handshake building, and now there was shouting from the street as the oncoming police spotted them. He joined the crush of bodies, pushing grimly into the narrow hallway, then sprinting in the opposite direction to most of the Webblies, for he had seen Jia running that way, holding tight to Lu's hand, and Jia seemed to have the survival instincts of a city rat. If she was running that way, he'd run that way too. But she'd gotten ahead of him, and when he skidded around the corner and found himself looking at a short length of corridor ending with an unmarked door. Neither she nor Lu were anywhere to be seen. He paused for a second, then the unmistakable sound of a gunshot and a rising wave of panicked screams drove him forward, hurtling for the unmarked door, hands stretched out to turn the knob, which was locked. He bounced off the door, stunned, and went on his ass, and shouted a single, panicked shit, as he cracked his head on the dirty tile floor. As he struggled back into a seated position, he saw the door crack open. Jia's bloodshot eye peeked out at him, and she swore in imaginative, slangy Chinese. "Guilo," she hissed. Quickly. He got to his feet quickly and reached the door in 2 quick steps. Her long fingernails dug into his arm as she dragged him inside the dimly lit space, which he saw now was a kind of supply closet that someone had converted into sleeping quarters, with a rolled-up bed in one corner and a corner of one shelf cleared of cleaning products and disinfectant and piled with a meager stack of clothes and collection of toiletries and a small vanity mirror. "The matron," Jia said, whispering so quietly that Wei Dong could barely hear her. "She gets to live in here for free. She and I have an arrangement." Lu was on his hands and knees behind her, silently rearranging the crowded space, working with a small LED flashlight clamped between his teeth. He was breathing heavily, his skinny arms trembling as he hefted the giant bottles of bleach and strained to set them down without making a sound. "Can I help?" Wei Dong whispered. Jia rolled her eyes. "Does it look like there's room to help?" she said. She was so close to him that he could see her individual eyelashes, the downy hair on her earlobes. If he took a deep breath, he'd probably crush her. He shook his head minutely. "Sorry." Lu made a satisfied grunt and detached the entire bottom shelf from its bracket. Wei Dong could see that he'd uncovered an access hatch set into the wall, and it showered dust and paint chips onto the floor in a cockroach wing pattern as he worked it loose. He passed it back and Jia tried to grab it, but there wasn't room to maneuver it in the small space. From the other side of the door, he heard the tromp, tromp. Tromp of heavy boots, heard the thudding and pounding on the doors. The muffled and frightened conversations of people roused from their beds in the middle of the night. With a low, frustrated, frightened sound, Jia grabbed the hatch cover and moved it out of the way, bashing him so hard in the nose that he had to stuff his fist in his mouth to stop from crying out. She gave him a contemptuous look and shoved the hatch into his hands. It was about 30 inches square, filthy, awkward, made from age-softened plywood. Lu had passed through the hatch already, and now Jia was following, her bare legs flashing in the half-light of the room, and then Wei Dong was alone, and the tromp of the boots was louder. Someone was scuffling in the hallway, a man, shouting in outrage, a woman, screaming in terror, a baby, howling. Wei Dong knelt down and peered into the tiny opening. It was pitch dark in there. He carefully leaned the cover up against the wall beside the opening and then climbed in. The floor on the other side was unfinished concrete, gritty and dusty. He couldn't see a thing as he pulled himself forward on his elbows. Commando style, his breath rasping in his ears. He inched forward, feeling cautiously ahead for obstructions, and then discovered that he was holding something soft and pliant and warm. Jia's breast. She hissed like a snake and swiped his hand away with sudden violence. He began to stammer an apology, but she hissed again. "Shish." He bit back the words. "Close up the grating," she said. He cautiously began to turn around. The little space was a mere meter high and he repeatedly smashed his head into the ceiling, which had several unforgiving metal pipes running along it that bristled with vicious joints and teeth. And he kicked both Jia and Lu several times. But he eventually found himself with his head and arms outside the hatch, and he desperately fitted his fingers to the inside of the grill and inched it into place. It was nearly impossible to maneuver it into the tight space, but he managed, his fingers white, and all the while, the sounds from the corridor grew louder and louder. "Got it," he gasped and slithered away. There were voices from just outside the door now. Deep, impatient male voices and an angry, shrill woman's voice telling them that this was the stupid broom closet and to stop being so stupid. Someone shook the doorknob and then put a shoulder into the door, which shuddered. Wei Dong bit his tongue to hold in the squeak and pushed back even more, the fear on him no, a live thing in his chest. Jia and Lu pushed at him as he collided with them, but he barely felt it. All he felt was the fear of the armed men on the other side of the door. About to come through and see the closet and the obvious gap on the bottom shelf where things had been shoved aside. Wei Dong was suddenly and painfully aware of how far he was from home, an illegal immigrant with no rights in a country where no one else had rights, either. He would have cried if he hadn't been scared to make a sound. "Come on," Jia whispered, a sound barely audible as another crash rocked the door. Someone had a key in the lock now. Jiggling it. She clicked a tiny red LED to life and it showed him the shape of the space, a long, low plumbing maintenance area. The pipes above them gurgled and whooshed softly as the water sluiced through them. Lou was beside him, Gia ahead of them, and she was crawling to the opposite side of the area. He followed as quickly as he could, ears straining for any sound from behind him. Gia swore under her breath. "What?" Lou said. "I can't find the other grating," she said. "I thought it was right here, but…." Wei Dong understood now. The maintenance area occupied a dead space between their building and the one behind it, and somewhere around here, there was a grating like the one they'd come through, a little wormhole into another level of the game. Gia's survival instincts were incredibly sharp, that much had been obvious, so he wasn't altogether surprised to discover that she had a back door prepared. He peered into the darkness. His whole body slicked with sweat and grimed with the ancient dust covering the floor. The last time. There was a light on the other side. "It was easy to find," she said, her voice near panic. He heard the unmistakable sound of the police entering the utility closet behind them, then voices. "We need to search the whole wall," Lou said. "Split up." So Wei Dong found himself squirming over Gia's bare calves, tearing his jeans on one of the low pipes as he did so. He patted the wall blindly, feeling around. Away from the small red light, it was pitch black, disorienting, frightening. Nearby, he heard the sounds of Gia and Lou searching too. And then, he found it. His baby fingertip slipping into a grating hole, then he patted around it, felt its full extent. "Here, here," he whispered loudly, and the other two began to struggle his way. He jiggled the grating, trying to find the trick that would make it come away, but it appeared to be screwed in. Increasingly desperate, he shook the grating, causing a rain of dust and dried paint to fall on his hands. He was gripping the metal so hard he could feel it cutting into one finger, a trickle of blood turning into mud as it mixed with the dirt. "Light," he said. "Can't see anything." A hand patted the length of his leg, feeling its way up his body, to his arm, then pressed the little light into his hand. Gia's hand, slim and girlish. He clicked the red light to life and peered intently at the grating. It wasn't screwed in, but it needed to be pushed slightly forward before it would lift out. He stuck the light's handle between his teeth and pushed and lifted, and the grating popped free. Just as it did, a long cone of light sliced through the crawlspace, and then a martial voice demanded, "Halt!" The light bathed him, making him squint, and Gia thumped him in the thigh and said, "Go." He went, commando crawling again. Gia's slim hands pushing him to hurry him along. He emerged into a tiled space, dirty and dark, the floor wet and slimy. He stood up cautiously, worried about hitting his head again. Then stooped to help Gia through. There were more shouts coming from the other side of the grating now, and the light spilled out of it and painted the greenish scum on the old, cracked gray tile floor. "Halt!" again, and "halt!" once more, as Gia finished wriggling through and he bent to grab Lou, peering into the now brilliantly lit crawlspace. Lou had been searching for the grating at the other end of the crawlspace, and he was going as fast as he could, his face a mask of determination and fear, lips skinned back from his teeth, blood flowing freely from a scalp wound. "Halt!" again, and Lou put on a burst of speed, and there was the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. Lou's eyes grew wide and he flung his arms out before him and dug his hands into the ground and pulled himself along, scrambling with his toes. "Come on," Wei Dong begged, practically in tears. "Come on, Lou." A gunshot, that flat sound he'd heard in the distance when he was living in downtown LA, but with an alarming set of whining aftertones as the bullet bounced from one pipe to another. Water began to gush onto the floor, and Lou was still too far away. Wei Dong went down on his belly and crawled halfway into the space, holding his arms out. Come on," crooning it now. Not sure if he was speaking English or Chinese. And Lou came, and halt, and another gunshot. Then two more, and the water was everywhere, and the whining ricochets were everywhere, and then, Lou screamed. A sound like nothing Wei Dong had ever heard. The closest he'd heard was the wail of a cat that he'd once seen hit by a car in front of his house, a cat that had lain in the street with its spine broken for an eternity, screaming almost like a human, a wail that made his skin prickle from his ankles to his earlobes. Then, Lou stopped. Lay stock still. Wei Dong bit his tongue so hard he felt blood fill his mouth. Lou's eyes narrowed, the pupils contracting. He opened his mouth as though he had just had the most profound insight of his life, and then blood sloshed out of his mouth, over his lips, and down his chin. Lu, Wei Dong called, and was torn between the impulse to go forward and get him and the impulse to back out and run as fast as he could, all the way to California if he could. And then, "Stay where you are," in that barking, brutal Chinese, and the gun was cocked again. He smelled the blood from his own mouth and from Lu, and Lu slumped forward. Then a gunpowder smell. Then, another shot, which whined and bounced with a deadly sound that left his ears ringing. "Stay where you are," the voice said, and Wei Dong scrambled backwards as fast as he could. Jia yanked him to his feet, her face grimed with dust and streaked with tears. "Lu," she said. He shook his head, all his Chinese gone for a moment, no words at all available to him. Then Jia did an extraordinary thing. She closed her eyes, drew in a deep breath, drew it in, squeezed her fists and her arms and her neck muscles so that they all stood out, corded and taut. And then she blew it all out, unclenched her fists, relaxed her neck, and opened her eyes. "Let's go," she said, and, with a single smooth motion, turned to the door behind her and shot the bolt, turned the knob and opened it into another apartment building corridor, smelling of cooking spices and ancient ground in body odor and mold. The dim light from the hallway felt bright compared to the twilight he'd been in since diving through the bolt hole, and he saw that he was in a disused communal shower, the walls green with old mold and slime. Jia dug a pair of strappy sandals out of her purse and calmly and efficiently slipped them on. She produced 2 sealed packets of wet wipes, handed one to Wei Dong and used the other's contents to wipe her face, her hands, her bare legs, working with brisk strokes. Though Wei Dong's heart was hammering and the adrenaline was surging through his body, he forced himself to do the same, shoving the dirty wipes in his pocket until there were no more. There were more shouts from the grating behind them, and distant sounds from the street below, and Wei Dong knew it was hopeless, knew that they were cornered. But if Jia was going to march on, he would too. Lu was behind him, with the coppery blood smell, the bonfire smell of the gunpowder. Ahead of him was China, all of China, the country he'd dreamed of for years, not a dream anymore, but a brutal reality. Jia began to walk briskly, her arm waving back and forth like a metronome as she crossed the length of the building and opened the door to the stairway without breaking stride. Wei Dong struggled to keep up. They pelted down 3 flights of stairs, the grimy, barred windows allowing only a gray wash of light. It was dawn outside. Only 1 flight remained, and Jia pulled up abruptly, wheeled on her heel and looked him in the eye. Her eyes were limned with red, but her face was composed. "Why do you have to be white?" she said. "You stand out so much. Walk 5 paces behind me, 3 paces to the side, and if they catch you." "I won't stop." He swallowed. Tried to swallow. His mouth was too dry. Lu was dead upstairs. The police were outside the door, he heard calls. Radio chatter, engines, sirens, shouts, and they were murderous. He wanted to say, "Wait, don't open the door. Let's hide here." But he didn't say it. They were doomed in here. The police knew which building they'd entered. The longer they waited, the sooner it would be before they sealed the exits and searched every corner and nook. "Understood," he managed, and made his face into a smooth mask. 1 more flight. Jia cracked the door and the dawn light was rosy on her face. She put her eye to the crack for a moment, then opened it a little wider and slipped out. Wei Dong counted to 3, slowly, making his breath as slow as the count, then went out the door himself. Chaos. The street was a little wider than most of the lanes near the handshake buildings, a main road that was just big enough to admit a car. A car idled at one end of it. 2 policemen outside it. 3 more police were just entering the building he'd come out of, using a glass door a few yards away. The blue police car bubble lights painted the walls around them with repeating patterns of blue and black. Somewhere nearby, shouting. Lots of shouting. Boyish yells of terror and agony, the thud of clubs, screaming from the balconies.